very existence is wrapped up in the things you are here to fulfill. Whatever you choose for a career path, remember the struggles along the way are only meant to shape you for your purpose.
Welcome to In Bloom. I am your host, Mihaly, and this is a pro-humanity podcast.
All right. On today's episode, we have on Gabriel Mitchell. He is an atheist, an anarchist, and a lover of freedom and philosophy. We talked about freedom, misconceptions about anarchy, atheism versus Christianity, objectivity versus subjectivity, free will, and so much more. Today's episode has been shortened a bit because it was very long, but if you want to find the longer version, you can find it on our YouTube channel, which will be linked in the description below. Let's get into this episode. All right. So welcome, Gabriel Mitchell. He is an armchair philosophy nerd who, without a degree, has managed to create a career following his passion for philosophy. The topic that he's most interested in is the topic of freedom, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. All right, Gabe, take it away and tell us your background. Why philosophy?
Thank you so much, man. I'm really excited to be here. And I'm always really excited by kind of smaller projects like this, because I know this is pretty early on. You're kind of just getting started. And in some sense, part of what you're doing, right, is kind of increasing freedom in your own life. You've come up with this idea of something you want to pursue. And just by increasing your options available to you, in that sense, you're increasing your freedom. You know, you're learning this new skill of podcasting, which could transfer to a new job or something. And I think it's just cool to be part of that. I love philosophy, obviously. I just since like a young little kid have been just a huge nerd for it. My parents are big readers, and so I'm sure that was a contributing factor. Lots of good discussions around the dinner table and kind of book recommendations and things like that. But I especially noticed as I was getting older, and by older, I mean like as I was going through, say, high school and things like that, that my passion for ideas wasn't just some like aesthetic quirk. You know, it wasn't just the same way someone loves emo music or something like that. It was like, okay, this is a thing that can take me somewhere. This is something that will influence how I act and interact with other people. This is going to influence my career. And a really concrete example of that is we both know each other through a program called Praxis. And the man who founded it is a man named Isaac Morehouse, along with T.K. Coleman. And Isaac and I met because I was traveling the country going to like philosophy, libertarian oriented type events and just kind of ran into him. And I knew a little bit about him before because we had some like mutual friends and stuff, but it was because I was interested in ideas that I was I was on this path kind of meeting people, and Isaac was one of those people, and we talked about philosophy. That was like the first thing we talked about was like drug legalization and drug dealers as entrepreneurs and things like that. And it was a really perfect example of how even when I was in high school, philosophy was something that I could leverage for opportunities and leverage to build relationships. And to this day has remained such a core part of my experience as a human being.
The concept of drug dealers as entrepreneurs is a fascinating one. And if we have more time, then I definitely want to dig into that. But you gave a little bit of an intro on freedom. I would like kind of a more thorough understanding of what is freedom? Where is it rooted in? Like you, if whoever's listening doesn't know, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are you're an atheist, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And most people would assume that if you're religious, then you get to some sort of an innate sense of dignity, an innate sense of worth. How have you as an atheist gotten to that conclusion?
Yeah, and that's a fair question. I wasn't always an atheist. I will say that my father's a preacher, and so I grew up in a Christian environment. And as a result, definitely was into Christianity when I was a little bit younger. I really like C.S. Lewis, for example. But kind of in those high school years, as I was really refining what I believed, it was something that as much as I had a great experience with it, and I love Christianity, relative to other religions and other things I've experienced, I've gone all sorts of churches and all sorts of youth groups and things like that. I think that it just wasn't for me. And the deeper I got into the arguments for it, they didn't feel very compelling. And as I got into the arguments for alternative things like atheism, they felt a little bit more compelling. And I noticed that elements of Christianity seem to conflict with some of the more radical freedom-oriented philosophies I was starting to believe.
Like what?
And well, for example, I would consider myself an anarchist, and I have really explored those ideas for a long time. And there is a subsection of what's called Christian anarchism that tries to sort of integrate the two. But in a lot of ways, Christianity, and of course, when it comes to evaluating religions, right, there's a lot of interpretations, there's all this tradition, and it's hard to pinpoint, like, Christianity believes X about this topic or something. But a lot of Christian texts can be interpreted in a way that are not anarchistic, that are supporting of man-made governments as maybe a projection of God's will or things like that. And just on average, most Christians aren't anarchists, and that's some sort of evidence towards Christianity struggling in this area. And I've noticed that I'm a sincere believer in not just freedom, but also like having that deep fundamental right of like asserting that freedom, which is slightly a little bit different. In the sense that like I matter and my joy matters, my life matters, my self-interest matters, and I should have the right and freedom to pursue that. And sometimes Christianity is presented to me as rejecting that a little bit, as saying like, well, maybe you're free, but maybe your self-interest isn't the most important thing. Maybe, you know, you should live your life for other people and restrict your freedom a little bit for the benefit of other people. And stuff like that really didn't sit right with me. And again, I know Christianity is very complicated and there's a lot of interpretations, and I have close friends who are very much into freedom like I am and consider themselves Christians. But in my studies, I noticed a significant tension.
Okay, so back to the question about freedom. And then afterwards, I want to get to anarchism, because I think that to understand anarchism fully is there's a lot of stigma behind what anarchy is, and to really understand it is very important. So first freedom, and then anarchy.
So there's a couple different ways to think about freedom. And one thing I like to point out is that we can make a meaningful distinction between let's call it abstract freedom and concrete freedom. So there's certain things that are abstract freedoms. For example, on the topic of drugs, making marijuana legal is a change in the abstract freedom. There are certain concrete things that happen there, like the cop's not going to beat me up anymore for smoking a joint. But at its core, the law changing is an abstract thing, not really a concrete thing. Law is a bit more abstract, where there's concrete freedoms. Even if marijuana is illegal, I still live in a world where I can use technologies like Bitcoin to go on the internet and purchase marijuana. And of course, you know, it requires a little bit of technological know-how, but once you've kind of figured that out, it's a very safe, normal thing to do, and people do it all the time. And so those are two different types of freedoms. Even when I lack the abstract freedom that comes from the legalization change, I can still sometimes have that concrete freedom and get the thing that I want. And that distinction, I think, can be helpful for thinking about freedom. Because when we talk about anarchism, sometimes we're just talking about the abstract freedom. We want to remove the abstract barriers that are in our way. But sometimes it can be helpful to talk about increasing our concrete freedom. And that can expand beyond political philosophy and even into our personal life, which is when I talk about freedom, I don't just mean get rid of the state barriers that are in my way. I mean things like become stronger so you can have more access to how you want to spend your time, have more energy so you can be awake longer and do the things that you care about, have more money that will give you the freedom to make the investment decisions and care about and focus on projects like this that you care about. And so freedom isn't just a matter of this sort of abstract principle, but in many ways is this concrete thing about increasing our access to options and things that are available to us.
Okay. So then why does everybody have an innate freedom?
Have an innate freedom? So I think maybe a slightly better wording here is, why does everyone have kind of like an innate right to have freedom? Because in some sense, everyone has a little bit of innate freedom. And like at the very least, everyone has some concrete freedom, right? Even if you lived in the most totalitarian, evil place in the world and there was no abstract freedom whatsoever, you at least have like a decision of maybe what you're going to eat for the day, or at least the freedom to decide if you're going to walk left or right. That's still a type of freedom. Yeah,
or even the freedom about your own rational decisions. Like, am I going to be happy right now, or am I going to be upset? Or
Yeah. And in fact, the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, maybe Sartre, I can never figure out the French names, but he has some great quote about how we're basically doomed to be free. So he himself was a prisoner of war during World War II. And so he was a French guy, and the Nazis came in, and he was in one of their prison camps. And he has some quotes and some writings about how, as much as that was like, and he didn't use the abstract concrete distinction, but as much as that was where his abstract freedom was constricted the most, he, in a lot of ways, became a lot more aware of his sort of concrete freedom. He became much more aware of the little decisions he made day to day and the amount of free will that he had in those moments. Even when Nazis were literally telling him what to do, he noticed he was more free than ever. I think he literally said something like he's never felt more free than the time he was in the prison camp. And so we at least have innate freedom in that sense. But a more important question maybe is like, how do we know we have this right to pursue those freedoms? And how do we know we have the right to tell the government not to restrict our freedoms, those sorts of things, which would be a very difficult topic. There's a long history of people like John Locke and people in what's called the classical liberal tradition who believed that rights, so many of them believe that rights came from God, but there is a lot of secular sort of writings and interpretations there, that rights are kind of just this innate part of our human nature. And in some sense, you can understand that through like a lens of need. Like if you know that by virtue of being a human being, you need some sort of freedom, that is at least a starting point for thinking about where these rights might come from.
can you explain a little bit more about give an example of why you might need freedom as a human being?
Mm-hmm. Well, so you exist as a human being, and you, if you want to live at the very least, you need things like food and water and stuff like that. And so you need to have the freedom to go and pursue the productivity necessary to go get those things. Mm-hmm. And so that might mean the freedom to trade with people, or that might mean the freedom to take unowned natural resources and own them and work on them and use them to build things. And so just part of what it means to be human implies this sort of necessary condition of needing that freedom to go do these things in general.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, now, the topic of anarchy. Whenever I first heard that topic, I obviously had some thoughts of my own, but most of that was pre-programmed and most of that was deeply instilled. Most people assume that anarchy is chaos. Explain why it's not.
Yeah, you know, it's really funny, and I think I'm going to share something with you that you've probably never heard. Okay. Everyone's familiar with kind of the anarchy A symbol, right? We have this like A, and it's in a circle. What most people don't know is historically that circle is not a circle, it's an O, because the quote that inspired the symbol is "Anarchy is order." And I can't off the top of my head remember who was the philosopher that said it, but from some of the earliest writings around anarchism as like a structured political philosophy, obviously in some sense anarchism existed throughout history, but as like a structured political philosophy that people have been arguing for and advocating for. In those origins, people felt as if anarchism was an expression of order, maybe more a natural order, if that makes sense. There's an image. It is a really good example of one way to think about order and chaos that I think can illuminate. And this image is worth editing into this video whenever you post it. Okay. And for anyone who's following along, the image is, and I'll describe it just in case you're unable to. It's order. It is an image of a pine tree, like leaf, I guess, a pine tree branch. Mm-hmm. And at the top, we have the pine tree branch in its natural order, all kind of like all of the needles are attached to the branch, and the caption here is order. And then the next panel is the pine tree separated out, and all these little pine needles are stacked on top of each other to create what we might perceive as more orderliness. Mm-hmm. But the caption says chaos. And because I think what's being communicated here, and I just absolutely love this image, is that sometimes what we perceive as chaos is actually a destruction of natural order. And often what the anarchist is trying to suggest is that even if my ideas come off as chaotic, I'm saying we should organize society without leaders, that seems chaotic. What I'm really trying to get at is that I'm presenting a natural order. Economists actually have a term called spontaneous order, where what they use to describe examples of ways that order naturally arises without the need of someone telling us what to do. A good example is language. Mm-hmm. In some sense, we've had some authorities throughout history try to adjust language, mm-hmm. but language in general is not something that came because one smart person decided, I'm in charge, this is how we're going to speak. Language naturally arose as an emergent order through a system almost like evolution. And in a system that we might think of chaotic in some sense, but language is one of the more like orderly things. We have all these rules around grammar, and these develop naturally in an emergent order. And so we have these spontaneous and natural orders. And the anarchist, like myself, is trying to say, no, society shouldn't come from this artificial order that has the risk of creating chaos. The real true lack of chaos comes from this more natural order and aligning ourselves with that.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. That's a very, very different reframe. So how would you get to this anarchy?
Yeah, so I should say that I have a particular vision of anarchism, and anarchism is a very long, broad historical tradition that has been defined not just by specific sets of ideas, but also movements that have changed those. And political philosophy is kind of hard because of this, because you're not just dealing with ideas in the abstract, you're dealing with human beings and the parties and the governments that are defining these terms. And so my vision of anarchism is what is sometimes called free market anarchism or market anarchism, sometimes called anarcho-capitalism. Not a huge fan of that capitalist word, but let's just call it market anarchism. And so what I envision is a world in which we don't have a government, but we still have things like money and property. And we still have things like production of goods and services through a market economy. Mm-hmm. And part of why I find that compelling is that I'm not a big fan of monopolies. And the state strikes me as the big monopoly. And so just as I don't like it when there's monopoly on burgers, and I don't like it when there's monopoly on, goods and any sorts of goods and services, the government seems to have a monopoly on the good and service of, let's call it law and order or rights protections or something like that. And I think that monopoly comes with all these problems, as any monopoly would. And so I want to compete with that monopoly. I want to build a world where the goods and services of law and order is coming from entrepreneurs, not just entrepreneurs, maybe also like nonprofits and direct action charities and just helping out your neighbor or something. But it's coming from a competition. It's coming from this array of different nodes instead of this singular node. I want it decentralized. And so if I'm thinking in terms of competition decentralization, well, that opens the door of a certain tactic for getting there. Because I don't actually have to, throw a brick through the White House, or I don't have to vote in my guy who's going to slowly dismantle the state or whatever. And sometimes I don't even have to convince people of argument. What I can do is I can invest in entrepreneurial projects that are trying to compete with the state. Popular example is Bitcoin, right? Just as the government has monopoly on like law and order, the government right now sort of has a monopoly on money. And it can do things like print all the money it wants to buy all the bombs that it wants to go kill all these children across seas or whatever. Or it can print money to do things like potentially help people or something, whatever. Regardless, it has all this control because it has this centralization and has this monopoly. And so just as I could complain about it, I could vote it out, what I want to do is I want to compete with it. I want to say, let's go put some money in Bitcoin and use that as an alternative currency, so I've opted out. And so my theory of transition or my theory of revolution is a nonviolent theory that stems from believing in the power of competition and the entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm. So tell me if this is correct. So what I'm piecing together in my mind is that it starts with freedom. It starts with this basic freedom that says that you can choose. Like you get to choose and nobody's going to tell you that you have to do something, because innate to you. There are not things that say you have to do things. Like most of the time we get so used to our rules that they become a part of us. It's like, I have to do this. So first you step outside of that. And then you're saying, along with like anarchy, the way that you envision anarchy is, let's set up systems and structures that allow us to live out our freedom as best as possible without somebody telling us what we need to do, and it more so being like a social contract, but a legitimate social contract.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to think about it. And as you were saying something, I thought of something. Part of how we know that we have this like innate right to our freedom is that freedom seems to be the natural state. That all these things that are in the way are these artificial things. They're ghosts that are haunting our mind. Many of them aren't even real. Like an example would be the legitimate authority of the state. Certainly the state has people with guns, and that's concretely blocking my freedom. But the abstract authority of the state just doesn't exist. It's purely a fiction. And so part of how we know we have this kind of innate freedom is all the things that are saying that we don't are just fake. They're just fictions. They're these ghosts that we can cast out and free our mind and free our bodies and build these sorts of freedoms. And so, yeah, you're right to think about it in terms of, I believe that there's some sort of core right or some sort of core innate freedom, and that we should be allowed to enact that out on the world. And so part of how I want to get there is I want to outcompete these fictions and barriers that are in the way and just build the freedom and build the alternatives. And hopefully people will naturally gravitate towards those. Mm-hmm. And maybe make some profit in the process.
It's not a bad idea.
Yeah.
I want to clarify. So whenever you say fictions and ghosts, what you mean is basically that every aspect of society we have created, and we have gotten so used to our society as what we have created that we think that it's necessary to be like this. It has to be like this. But whenever you say fiction, it's basically just, we tell ourselves that it has to be like this, and that is the fiction. And yeah. What kind of a society could you imagine? That's what you're proposing, right?
Yeah, exactly. There are ghosts in your mind that are telling you you're not free, and you just have to exit them. You just have to whatever the word is for removing bad spirits and ghosts and those sorts of things. Exorcism, there you go. You have to exercise your mind of these ghosts that are limiting your freedom. And sometimes those ghosts aren't just like government. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's your parents telling you you couldn't do things when you were a child, and so now you have this bad belief in your head that you're incapable or something. And so freedom isn't just this political abstract thing, right? Freedom is also this personal thing. And so I care not just about economics, and I care not just about smashing the state or whatever. I also care about helping people have better careers and helping people just be happier, healthier, freer people.
I love that. I think so one thing that I heard on a podcast recently was that, and this will just kind of further the point that there are things in your mind and you kind of bind yourself to them. There was this person who had a split personality disorder, and what was interesting was whenever they were different people, like they were different sides of themselves, they were allergic to different things. So crazy.
I very briefly had a romantic connection with a woman who suffered from some personality disorder. I think the technical term right now is like DID, like dissociative identity disorder or something. Mm-hmm. And it was very educational. But fortunately, she was able to get access to the mental health services that she needed. Specifically, there was EMDR therapy or whatever, rapid eye movement therapy, which the basic idea is like while you're doing therapy and talking about traumas, you have your eyes moving back and forth really fast, which does something to activate parts of the brain that helps process traumas. Because DID, split personality specifically, has a lot to do with traumas. And so if you process those traumas, you can heal it. And in some sense, she became more free, right? Because like literally there were moments in her life where she was a different person. And in those moments had zero freedom because she had zero control over what was going on. And through going to therapy and getting the help she needed, drastically increased her freedom day to day.
Interesting. Interesting. No, it's very interesting how powerful your mind is, and how if you believe something or you tell yourself something, then you can actually hurt yourself. Um, okay, so I actually am super intrigued. Why do you specifically care so much about freedom that you've made it such a big part of your life?
So a question like that, I think, is going to have two sort of overlapping answers. There's going to be the intellectual and the personal. Because, it's like asking well, why'd you become a football player, right? There's certain things about just my upbringing and the experiences I had that influenced that. But then there was also a rational deduction and a rational exploration of philosophy that told me freedom was good. I would suspect that part of the appeal was growing up in an environment where I was introduced to a lot of freedom-oriented philosophy early on. I was introduced to classical liberalism, mostly through a more conservative lens, but I was able to kind of appreciate that at a time. And I think that was a big part of it. I also noticed that I noticed something growing up, that when people did not recognize the amount of freedom and control that they had in their life, that bad things tend to happen. If they thought they had to take the job that their parents wanted them to take instead of the job that they wanted, even if in the short term it appeased their parents and minimizes conflict, in the long term they were fucked. They would deeply regret these decisions and end up with all this emotional turmoil. And I just noticed that it was such an important part of living a happy, healthy life to simply recognize the amount of freedom that you actually have deep down, to simply accept and give that space. That was such a big difference in certain people's lives, that when they missed out on that, bad psychological things happened. And so that's something I really noticed. And so that influenced not just interest in philosophy on that kind of concrete personal level, but also the abstract level, because they kind of interconnect there. And so when you live in a society that say is limiting your freedom because of this color of your skin or something, that's gonna hurt. It hurts you physically and emotionally and psychologically. And so when you can find ways of increasing your freedom and removing those barriers, it's good for you. And so I think it's just thought processes like that were a big catalyst and inspiration.
Mm-hmm. And you've made this your life. So this is your career. You love philosophy. You love fighting and going into these things. Why is it so important for you to help spread this throughout society?
I think that finding what's meaningful in life is in part about finding the intersection of what do you enjoy? What do people need? What are people willing to pay for? Things like that. Just as when you think about having a meaningful career, those are the type of things you should think about. You should be also thinking about that and having a meaningful, joyful life. And so partly I just want to say it's what I like to do. And that's enough, that's enough. But it's what I like to do. And also people are willing to pay for it. And also people seem to need it. And also it has opened all these spectacular doors for meeting interesting people like yourself, to have these opportunities to talk on podcasts, to read cool books, to engage intellectuals that I care about and have them as peers. Just making the conscious decision to pursue what was naturally what I value and what I'm passionate about just had such an amazing payback and continues to compound. And so it's even if I have those moments where oh, I should go do something else, the value just keeps rolling in, and I'm going to keep following that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I did a little bit of research on some of the topics that you told me you were most into, some of which being objectivism, Max Stirner, and Ayn Rand.
Yes.
And okay, so first I want to ask you about your thoughts on the will and free will.
The will and free will. Okay, so free will is a very complicated philosophical topic, and I'm not going to say it's an area of expertise for me. when recently I've been reading a little bit of how Ayn Rand explores the topic of free will, and it seems to be compelling. Basically this. First of all, even if you say we don't have free will, we at least have some sort of experience of free will. And experience is very good evidence. It's not conclusive, undeniable proof, but experience is pretty big. Like if I experience that there's a chair in front of me, even if I can't philosophically present the hardcore argument that there's a chair in front of me, just the fact that I have that experience with my senses is pretty good evidence. Not conclusive, undeniable proof, but very good evidence. And free will is one of those things that we have a very radical experience of. Like even people who say that they don't have free will can't escape it. And interestingly enough, often when people say they don't have free will, we notice weird consequences, that people who start to reject their free will start to be less happy, start to make worse decisions. And so not only is there this experience of free will, but it seems to come with cost and benefits and consequences for rejecting it. And so for Rand, not only is that observation, but she makes note that a lot of people who reject free will are doing it because they think free will means radical freedom. They think it means we can make whatever decision we want whenever. For example, someone who rejects free will might think that free will means that we can pick our favorite ice cream or something like that. And it's simply a matter of fact that we don't have undeniable, unimaginable free will. We certainly have restrictions, and things like our upbringing and our genetics influence sort of who we are and the decisions we make. But we at least have the decision about things like thinking. Like if I was confused about the topic of free will, I could choose to just ignore it. Or I could choose to activate my volition, which is sort of this rational faculty we have to just be thinking and focusing on things. I can at least choose to have this volition to think about this topic and try to come up with a conclusion. And so even if I don't have radical freedom in all ways, I at least have the freedom to choose to think about a thing, which is pretty big. And maybe even that's just it. Maybe that's the only one point of freedom that we actually have, is our ability to like choose to think about a thing or not. But the consequences of that are pretty important, because if we choose to not think about things, we have certain consequences. And when we choose to think about things, we have different consequences. And so for Rand, and I myself find it very compelling, at the very least, we have this volition, and the volition is where we can find this free will. And it's not a radical, unending free will, but we at least have something. And it seems to be an important part of embracing that or denying that seems to have really important consequences that are undeniable.
Interesting. That's a concept that I'm definitely going to focus more on, is just the costs and benefit of certain innate things. Like that's not something that I've thought about deeply, but it is interesting how interwoven that is into life. Okay, so you brought up the point of objectivity and seeing a chair and it being there, and that is objective. There are a lot of interesting, arguments around subjectivity and perception. And I know that Rand is very big on objectivity and truth and fact being fact.
Yep.
What would she say, and or if you don't feel comfortable saying what she would say, but what would you say about subjectivism in terms of perception?
Yeah, well, first we need to be a little bit clear about exactly what we mean when we say things like objective and subjective, because sometimes that's the confusion is when someone says, oh, the world is subjective, they just don't know what they're saying. Sometimes that's going on. One way philosophers think about objective and subjective is to just investigate the word. Subject is the subject, object is the object. When I'm saying something is objective, I'm saying it's about the object. When I'm saying something is subjective, I'm saying it's about the subject's relationship to the object. An example might be, let's say we're watching a movie together, and I say, this movie is 5 hours long. It could be right, it could be wrong, but what's important about that is I'm saying something about the object, the movie. I'm making an objective statement in that sense. If I say this movie is funny, I'm probably making a subjective claim. I'm probably saying that I have the experience of humor when I watch this movie, and so my interpretation of this movie subjectively is that it's a funny movie, right? So that's kind of the difference between objective and subjective in one of the ways that philosophers talk about this thing. And so when people say things like there is no objective truth or there is no objective reality, it's very confusing to me because it seems like what they're saying is there is nothing beyond my subjective experience or nothing exists outside of my mind. And then I get a little confused because it's like, well, how the hell would you even know that? And the response is like, well, maybe one evidence is that my senses are limited. I don't know if I'm hallucinating all of these things. But in order for me to talk about senses, I have to already concede that they are at least somewhat useful and at least somewhat true. Because like, how do I know that my senses are limited if I'm not using my senses to discover that? Does that make sense? And so many of the arguments that people try to put forward towards a radical view of subjectivity, and obviously some things are subjective, but towards this like radical view of everything is in the mind, all things are a matter of opinion, seems to be a confusion about the language sometimes, and also just like a rejection of logic and truth overall. Like, how do you assert something like all things are subjective without that itself being a type of objective claim, without that itself being a claim about external reality? And so a lot of these kind of positions sort of just fall flat, I guess, and are self-contradictory, and will even use the things that they're rejecting to try to make a position, like saying, I know my senses aren't good because I use my senses. And so that's I really struggle with that topic of subjectivity and objectivity, because no one has been able to really explain exactly what they mean when they say everything's subjective without running into really obvious errors and contradictions.
I like that. Recently, I was talking with somebody and we were talking about things being black and white. And this person was saying that most things are gray. And I thought about it for a moment and I was like, most things are only gray because you don't actually understand them. Like I think that most things are not actually gray.
Yeah. And like, certainly some things are gray, right? But yeah, a lot of things really are a matter of just true or false, and that's it. Really are just a binary. A view I have that is for example, I think morality has actually a lot of black and white. I'll make a bold claim that it is wrong to torture babies for sexual pleasure, and that is a black and white statement. There is no moral grayness there, especially because I've added the necessary context. You know what the motivation is. You know who the victim is. You know this. Once you have that information, then the grayness is just gone. And so sometimes grayness in questions of philosophy and morality is just because you just in the moment don't have the information you need to reach the conclusion, just as you're saying, just because you just don't understand it. But once you understand it, most philosophical topics, I'll be careful not to say most because I don't want to add the list or whatever, but a decent amount of philosophical topics, probably more than most people suspect, are actually just a matter of binary truth and just a matter of black and white.
No, that's interesting. Okay, so you talked about morality. How have you come to your position and understanding of morality? And I don't know if this is slightly ignorant, but the way that I would assume is that there are a lot of moral teachings inside of something like Christianity or some sorts of religions. And I see a lot of people that are very, very, religious or whatever, very into morality. How did you as an atheist come to your conclusions about morality?
What's interesting is that part of why I became an atheist was because of my conclusions of morality first.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so I'm very, very inspired by Ayn Rand and a lot of her moral system, and I think it's mostly correct. Little bits of nuances here and there, but overall, I think it's correct. And one thing I noticed when I was studying her work is that there's a compelling case to be made for what's called egoism, which is the moral philosophy that asserting your self-interest is a good thing, that is a good thing to care about your happiness and your joy and your existence. And because I reached that conclusion that self-interest was a good thing, and some of the language can get a little confusing here, but I will make the assertion that if you properly understand philosophy and properly understand language, that selfishness is a good thing. A lot of people abuse and misuse that word, and it has a lot of different connotations, but I'm going to make that claim. Selfishness is a good thing. And because I reached that conclusion, I noticed that a lot of religions at their core try to reject that. Christianity, for example, its hero is Jesus. And Jesus is usually held up as the embodiment of self-sacrifice, as the rejection of selfishness, because he literally died, literally suffered for other people, in theory at no personal gain. Now it's a little complicated, right? Because in the Christian mythology, he's actually God. And so he like knows the potential outcome of these things. And so pinpointing out, is it truly actually selfless, is complicated. But usually that's held up as an example of selflessness that humans are supposed to embody and copy. And that was in tension with the secular ideas around morality that I was discovering independently, that I was noticing like, well, selfishness actually isn't all that bad. If it's not neutral, it's at least good. Or if it's not good, it's at least neutral. And religions seem to be struggling with that and causing this area of tension. So part of why I'm an atheist is because I have such a strong sense of morality and what is true in the context of moral philosophy. And from that have reached the conclusion that religions are kind of in the way of that and are distorting this philosophical truth. And in fact, this actually goes all the way back to the Greeks. I'm blanking the exact like thought experiment or the exact book or whatever, but Socrates or someone is talking to another Greek and he says, are the gods just? And the guy says, yeah, of course they're gods, you know? And he says, okay, well, is this justice, are they just because they are gods? And like, are they the ones determining what justice is? And if they're not, is justice independent of gods? In which case, do we need gods for things like justice? And so another way of kind of illuminating that is just like, does morality require God? And often the Christians will say something like yes. Not just Christians, but most religious people will say yes. And we say, okay, well, is God the one inventing morality? And if yes, doesn't that make it kind of arbitrary? Doesn't that actually take morality out of the objective and put it into the subjective? It's just God's personal opinion. And so some religious folks might say yes. And then other religious folks might say like, well, no, God is just identifying kind of the natural law and communicating that to us or something. In which case, well, we don't need God. We seem to be pretty good at discovering that ourselves. And so this is one of the areas of tension of morality and religion that I have, is that I think you can discover a secularized version of morality and start with these like base principles and reach conclusions about what's good and evil and what's good and bad. And you don't actually need a God to get there. And in fact, often God muddies the water there and makes it, takes away some of the obviousness of it.
Okay, so explain that. So I have some thoughts on, I have questions.
Yep.
Just about your conclusions with God. So I'll ask those first, and then I'll get to the other thing. Okay, so with the God thing, you said if God instilled morality, does that make it subjective? Why would that matter if he's God? Like, if you believe in a God that is actually the God that you believe in, then the fact that he said it is almost like it takes away the necessity for it to be objective or subjective.
So if we knew undeniably that there is actually a God, then yeah, it doesn't even matter if we're talking about objective or subjective, because this God can literally send you to hell for not following his rules anyway. Yeah. So even just prudently, you might as well follow the rules. The trouble I have is that religious folks often present God is a necessary condition for objective morality. And what I'm trying to present is that, like, well, God maybe actually would destroy objectivity in morality. That's sort of what I'm trying to present.
Okay, explain that a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, because earlier we established like objective is external to subjects, and if God is a subject and morality is just this thing that he invented, then morality becomes subjective. It becomes a matter of his subjective preferences. And those might be immovable, and he might be the smartest dude in the world, and so his opinions are the best opinions or something. But it takes it away from it being a natural fact of like nature and being this objective external thing, and makes it this subjective thing within God.
So what if, and fix my thought process, but what if God was not a subject? Like, we think about him as a subject because that is easy for us to do. We think about him as a father or whatever, and that's easy for us to do. But in most of the Christian religions that I've ever explored or experienced, God is not just a subject. So then in that, he's semi-objective as well.
So I mean, in some sense, like things external to us are kind of objective, right? Like you and I are different entities, and so from my perspective, you could be an object that I'm like acting upon or something. Technically, you're another consciousness who has its own sort of subjective appearance, and so you're just so you, from your perspective, are a subject acting upon things. And so this can be a little difficult to pinpoint, but I guess what I am trying to communicate is that okay, if God is not a subject, if God is the universe or something, then you're right. Then if God is the universe and morality comes from God, then morality could be objective. In which case, though, it's like, well, isn't that very similar to the sort of secular perspective that I'm offering, right? That like morality is just like a natural thing, and that it's not this mystical thing that requires mysticism, that requires a god to invent it, so requires this or that. And so I guess the more you take away the subject of God, the more you take away the personness of God, then I think God becomes less interesting and also becomes just another part of nature, in which case I actually think you're starting to take away some of the godliness, because God seems to be, from a lot of religious perspectives, God is this thing outside of nature, this entity that is like acting upon nature and creating it and inventing it. But if God is just part of nature, God is just another word for saying the universe, or God is just another way of saying natural law, then that's a little bit more compatible with the type of the way I think about morality. But I think it also conflicts a lot with the way a lot of Christians would think about a God.
Okay, this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So the question lies in the being of God, like what form is God in? And then that's where then you take the conversation. It's just like, okay, well, once we can get to a concrete place about what we both agree the being of God is, then you can start talking about more everything else.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Okay, this is actually so fascinating to me, though, because I'm very intrigued by different religions, and I would have some questions for you about kind of miracles and all of the things around, and these interesting, just mind spirituality kind of a situation. Yeah, I don't know.
Sure. I actually have a lot to talk about. So right now for my work, at the time of us recording this, I'm helping put together a video project about spirituality.
Okay.
And we're trying to present a sort of objectivist secular take on spirituality that gives spirituality still a lot of weight and a lot of credence, and the preserves the goodness that it has, while grounding it in something a little bit more rational. And part of how you go about a project like that is really trying to define your terms. Because for some people, spirituality just means this good feeling I get sometimes. And sometimes spirituality means a structured belief system about the nature of the world. And I'm sure as you've been defining your spirituality and your practice and your beliefs, that is an area in which you're trying to figure out, like, not just what I believe about spirituality, but what is spirituality as a concept? Why does this exist in our language? What is its usefulness? What is the point of this sort of approach? And if you investigate, okay, so spirituality as a word, just in English language, ality means like pertaining to, and like the study of sometimes. Not ology is like study of, but like pertaining to. So spirituality means pertaining to the spirit. Okay. And so then we have to ask, well, what is a spirit? So some people are materialist and they say there is no spirit. We're nothing but chemical reactions in motion, and that's it. And I don't think that's very compelling, in part because, one, we have this experience of being something more than just rocks, or being more than just plants, or even just being more than most animals. So first we have that experience, which, as we've established already, experience is pretty good evidence. Not proof, but evidence. So we have that experience. And secondly, there are things that exist that we're familiar with that are not just a matter of chemistry and not just material. For example, ideas. Are ideas material? Where does liberty exist out there, right? Liberty isn't a thing that exists in the material world. Freedom isn't a thing that exists in the material world. We have interactions and physical things that we sometimes label as, oh, that's like an example of liberty or something. But liberty as a concept is immaterial. And our brains somehow have access to understanding these immaterial things and like kind of interacting with them. And so it would be very strange, I think, to say we're just material, it's all physical, but somehow we have this magical power to interact with immaterial things, and that's also just physical. I think that's a bit of a strange take. Instead, maybe there's something about our consciousness that isn't purely physical. And maybe that's a better explanation, because how else could our consciousness be interacting with these immaterial, non-physical things? It seems unlikely to me that physical things, and there's just this tension here of how do physical things interact with non-physical things? Well, perhaps our consciousness is this kind of mix of both physical and immaterial. And so maybe our spirit, because we're talking about spirituality is pertaining to the spirit. Maybe the spirit is that interaction. Maybe the spirit is just our consciousness. Maybe it's the parts of our consciousness that are immaterial, or the parts of our human nature that are immaterial that gives us access to these other immaterial things. And so the materialist who is saying it's purely physical, it seems to be running into this kind of error, and in a lot of ways just rejecting basic facts about what it's like to be human. On the other side, there's some people who their spiritual conviction is that all things are just ideas. A lot of the subjectivists sometimes fit into this. Literally, the position is usually called idealism. There are philosophers like Berkeley historically who believed in things like this. And that runs into kind of a similar problem where it's like, well, clearly some things exist outside of that, because in order for us to even have experiences, we need to be like interacting with things. So in order for us to even reach that conclusion, we need to have these sorts of experiences of physical stuff.
No, that's interesting. Okay, so can you explain a little bit, like, okay, so first, what is idealism as a philosophy?
Yeah, so I'm going to pull up the notes of what I've been working on just to simplify this for myself.
Okay, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Idealism is a philosophy that all things are ideas, meaning inside the mind. Because where else would ideas be? They're inside the mind. And so idealism usually runs into this problem like, well, is the mind at least physical? Like, how can you say that all things are ideas if you yourself have at least some physical components? Like, I think, therefore I am, right? Even if all things were simply inside my mind, well, at least my mind exists.
Rand has a quote on the opposite of I think, therefore I am. It's I am, therefore I think, which I thought was a good one.
Oh yeah, she was very good at taking the dualisms that people had throughout history and taking like the assumptions and sort of flipping them to find more useful truth. And her work has a lot of dualisms in them, and they're very good dualisms that are very useful. But sometimes her work is about like rejecting dualisms. For example, she really hated when people suggested sort of a tension between reason and emotion. And so they are separate things, but they're integrated and they like work together to reach conclusions.
Okay, do you think that Rand got anything wrong? Like, is there any part of her philosophy that you disagree with?
Yes. For example, she was not an anarchist. Okay. I think she was quite incorrect about that. So it's I think for me with Rand, it's like a lot of the base principles are very good, but some of the conclusions I think are inconsistent and run into problems. Okay. And so an example is like anarchism. That I think she just, there are steps to where she reaches a rejection of anarchism that just misunderstand what it is and what's being presented. And part of it is just a lack of imagination for how that system might function.
So can you explain that? And to give her the benefit of the doubt, could it, I mean, the technology that we have right now with Bitcoin, with literally so many different technologies that are coming out, blockchain, these options are more apparent. Like it's more apparent that this is actually potentially possible. And that's why you hear a lot of people talking about decentralization. Decentralization is very much in line with anarchy, correct?
Yeah, in some senses, it's almost synonymous. But yeah, I think you're absolutely onto something here. Part of why Rand, and even part of why a lot of very smart people were not anarchists historically, is because many of the innovations that made it a lot more obvious just didn't happen. And Bitcoin is a big one like that.
Mm-hmm. So then anarchy is such a trigger word to people today. But if decentralization and anarchy are synonymous, like would it almost do the movement of anarchism more and better to just start calling it decentralization? Because so many people are down for decentralization.
Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion here. I will say that there is one significant difference that's important. You could have a decentralized world in the sense that like every city becomes its own country. And that would be pretty close to anarchism, but technically it's not anarchism because each city still has a monopoly in that geographical location. In order for it to be anarchism in the most technical definition of the term, you have to have competition for governance for the product of law and order in the same geographical location. Because once you've given someone a monopoly in that geographical location, then it is no longer kind of anarchy for that little spot. And you'll notice, of course, in some sense, even in an anarchist world, you'd have these pockets of non-anarchy. For example, my apartment complex has kind of a monopoly on setting certain rules here. And so for that area, they don't have anarchy. Even in an anarchist world, they wouldn't. Or like my parents growing up in a household is not anarchy.
Makes sense. Okay, so I had a thought, and tell me if this is correct or wrong. I think that the difference between anarchy and decentralization is that anarchy focuses on what isn't, and decentralization focuses on what is.
I'm not sure about that. Okay. What I'll say is that anarchism is a specific type of decentralization in reference to government, where decentralization also could just be kind of broad. And I do kind of enjoy the aesthetics of like calling things anarchistic, even if they're not like truly about government. For example, I really like our friend Nick. He runs these masterminds, and these masterminds are a sort of decentralized way of doing like career coaching. And so sometimes when I talk to him, I say, yeah, these are very anarchistic, because there isn't really a leader and there isn't really like someone designing it. It's kind of this emergent order of people decentrally talking about things. And so that's like anarchism in one sense, but anarchism in the really strict political philosophy sense is specifically just about like state power and decentralizing that.
Okay. So explain to me a little bit more about decentralization, like how it's different in terms of, you said it's broader. There are these different categories. You said anarchism falls under one of those categories. What are the other categories? And well, obviously there are some people that believe in decentralization but not anarchy, and why is that? Like, where's the disconnect?
Yeah. So I'm not going to say that there are like clearly identified different categories of decentralization. Perhaps there is, but it was just not an area that I have read and studied. I think one thing is that some people see decentralization as only useful in certain contexts, which is kind of true. For example, there are certain work environments that benefit from having a boss, in which the power is sort of centralized at least a little bit. And that can be more practical sometimes, where there are other work environments that benefit from decentralization. And so sometimes it's a matter of context. I do think sometimes we have a status quo bias towards centralization. It's kind of what we grew up in, right? We go to schools in which there is a teacher who is a centralized authority. And then from the school, we then get into jobs that has a boss who is a centralized authority. And even before that, we had parents who are a centralized authority. And so all throughout our existence, we're used to centralized authorities. And so decentralization becomes something that we sometimes see as useful, but we just assume isn't most of the time. I think that assumption is largely incorrect. But it took us a while to get there, to learn that, to see the technologies where we see the examples, to see alternative forms of education pop up that views education through a more decentralized lens. And so I don't even think that decentralization needs to happen all the time in every case, but I do think we should default to assuming it's good in most cases, if not all cases, and that I think the central authority has to justify itself. That we shouldn't just assume, okay, there's a boss, there's a teacher, there's a government. We need to find a justification for decentralization. I think the centralized authority actually is the one who has to justify itself. Because if it can't, well then, gosh, maybe we should remove it and enact out this natural freedom that we've kind of established that we have, and just be more decentralized. But I think that's a big part of it, is this sort of status quo bias.
So your ideal system would be anarchy as your political philosophy behind everything, and then certain systems that promote decentralized whatever, but then also some systems that are not decentralized because they're better as not decentralized.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when we're doing philosophy, we really, really want there to be one label that we can throw on everything and say everything should be anarchistic. Unfortunately, I think that's just not how that's not how reality actually works. And so you have to understand the context of certain things. Yeah, and so like I'm not a big fan of having managers, but they're actually quite practical in a lot of contexts, and sometimes to the point of benefiting the worker in that context. Where there are other work contexts, like say a worker co-op, right, where decentralization is something that seems to be working and beneficial. And so I think you just have to be cautious of those contexts. The context that I think we absolutely need decentralization is in law and order, is in government, is in governance.
Okay. Got it. No, I really appreciate that, that understanding of it, just as like anarchy is your kind of default political philosophy, but you're not saying that I need anarchy in every single area of my life. It's just, rationally speaking, and because you've been doing so much digging into philosophy as a political philosophy, this is in line with humanity and freedom.
Yeah, I think you're on the right track there. That the conclusion I've reached is that anarchism needs to happen more, decentralization needs to happen more. And I have specific contexts that I think it really absolutely needs to happen. And I think it's a pretty good default. But it would be untrue for me to say in absolutely every case we have to abolish the authority, or we have to abolish the centralized power.
Okay, I like that a lot. Okay, so in a lot of objectivist philosophies and in a lot of the objectivist writings, they talk about freeing yourself, What does it mean to free yourself, and how do you do it?
Let me pull up a fun quote. A Max Stirner quote. Whoever will be free must make themselves free. Freedom is not a fairy gift to fall into a man's lap. What is freedom but to have the will to be responsible for oneself? So this is Max Stirner. Max Stirner conflicted a lot with like an Ayn Rand, and in a lot of ways, Stirner's work actually has a lot of subjectivism in it. But quotes like this is part of why I find his work really inspiring, is that he's had such a strong sense of that deep innate freedom of an individual, and such a strong calling towards embracing it and casting out the ghosts that are keeping us from getting there. In fact, that's where I get that ghost language, is from Max Stirner's work. Specifically, he was German, so he used the word Geist, which is sometimes translated into spooks, which is a very weird, outdated way to translate a word, but ghost is a pretty good word. And so an example of a ghost, right, is the belief that we don't have control over our career. And that's why we are participating in things like Praxis, because it's helping us remove this ghost that's haunting our mind. We're exercising it, and through that, becoming more free.
Mm-hmm. So how would you, if somebody came to you and they were looking for more freedom, like they wanted to find more freedom in their lives, they wanted to take on more responsibility, what are the first steps you would recommend to them?
I think one of the most important ghosts that you have to expel is the belief that your interest doesn't matter. Sometimes our lack of freedom, or at least our lack of motivation for asserting our freedom, is that we don't believe that we're worth us fighting for, that our life and our joy isn't something worth asserting. And so you can see this belief sometimes in larger cases. What I'm interested in is this thought process that people have that is basically, your interest doesn't matter. What matters is the community. And so therefore you have to do this thing. That's the thought process that I find problematic. Mm. And I think it's that thought process that has infected so much of our life and our psychology, particularly when we're dealing with our broader community, that limits our personal freedom. Mm-hmm. That limits both the concrete and the abstract freedom, because of course these things lead to actual laws. Regardless of whether or not vaccinations work or they're good or whatever, just the fact that we're compelled to ignore our interests, to ignore our wants, to ignore our happiness, limits the type of freedom that we have. Mm. And so I think one of the most important things, and as you can imagine, this is why I'm attracted to not just freedom, but also like self-interest and egoism, just like Ayn Rand, is that accepting that your interest is worthy of being pursued, that you're simply accepting the fact that your happiness matters can drastically increase your freedom. And I think for a lot of people is the necessary first step. It's not the only step, but it's a very necessary first step. Because if you don't even believe that your life matters, what the hell's the point of you having freedom? What the hell's the point of you asserting that and acting on it?
So what do you have to say to the people that, like what is your take on virtue and discipline in terms of not giving yourself what you want in a given moment?
Yeah, so certainly I believe in like discipline, and I believe in prioritizing long-term gain over short-term gain. I just because I think you should care about things like your happiness doesn't mean I think you should go get addicted to heroin, for example. Mm-hmm. And this is important because it shows the difference between what some people call hedonism, which is the philosophical position of prioritizing pleasure, versus egoism, which is the philosophical position of prioritizing self-interest. Pleasure is a necessary and important part of self-interest, but not the exclusive thing.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever take out self-interest to deepen your own character? Like, is that a thing?
I would argue that deepening your own character is inherently self-interested, selfish thing to do. And that if you really understand what character means, it's about yourself and it's about improving yourself, It's like we don't like we don't practice the virtues from the pure like Aristotelian sense of what virtues are. Like if you read Aristotle's work and you understand his justification for virtues, his work starts with like an egoist perspective. He starts with I think the term is eudaimonia or eudaimonia or whatever, which is just a Greek word for fulfillment and happiness and joy, and not just pleasure, not just happiness, but something a bit bigger, the good state. And you'll notice that his argument is that the virtues stem from that we are engaging the virtues because we're trying to achieve this eudaimonia, because we're trying to achieve our interests. We're not engaging the virtues because of the community. Part of a virtue is having a good relationship with the community, but that's not the starting point. We don't say we have to have a relationship with the community, therefore we have to have these virtues. We say we have to have a good relationship with ourself. We have to have self-esteem. We have to have fulfillment and joy. Therefore, we have to have the virtues. And one of those virtues is having a good relationship with your community and like respecting other people's property and stuff like that. But yeah, I think if you really truly understand what virtues are, they are inherently a selfish endeavor. And if you don't approach them from that perspective, you're likely to run into a lot of problems.
Okay, so I will propose a thought. This is interesting. What I understand from Christianity is that whenever you, so like for sure, whenever you do things for other people, it feels good. And I think that it's supposed to be like that. Like whenever you give to people, it feels good. It's not just a good thing for, them. It actually helps you as well. But I think the goal in Christianity is to get to a place where you're not doing it for yourself. And that's like, that is the ideal. And very, very, very few people will ever get there, but that's the ideal. And following that point, it's a sort of transcendence of self. And the interesting thing is that a lot of the times, the things that bring you the most happiness are actually things that help you to transcend yourself.
So some conceptions of Christianity think that you shouldn't take any pleasure from helping people. Not all, but some do. And I think those ones particularly are quite bad. Some conceptions of Christianity view pleasure as a negative signal. That maybe not pleasure is inherently bad from their conception, but if you're experiencing pleasure, that there's at least a chance that maybe what you're doing is actually sinful. And so some conceptions of Christianity encourage sort of removing pleasure and not having that as a motivator in your life. Obviously, not all conceptions of Christianity, and if there literally is a God, perhaps the most selfish thing to do would be to follow his rules so you can go to heaven and have a relationship with him and stuff, right? But you said this thing about transcending the self, and I wonder about that thought process because I guess I might need a better sense of what you mean, because in some sense you could just mean like caring about other people. Well, you can do that from the foundation of the self. And so maybe I don't fully understand what you mean when you say like transcending the self.
What I mean is mostly that whenever I have experienced like a good friendship or, a deep familial love, I don't think about myself. Like if I'm really in a good moment, then I won't be thinking about myself, or the times that I'm able to interact in society in ways that I am most proud of, most of the time I'm not thinking about myself. If I'm self-conscious, then I usually act more poorly than I would like to.
So it sounds like when you say thinking about yourself, you mean kind of this like hyper awareness of you. And I definitely think there are moments where removing that hyper awareness is beneficial. For example, when I'm playing a video game, I'm less interested in what's going on in my body and more interested in what's going on the screen. In some sense, that's almost like a transcession of self. And sometimes there's like psychedelic experiences I've had where I transcend, what people might call the ego or whatever. I think my problem isn't necessarily these like in these moments, these sort of transcendence, but a philosophical rejection of the self at the foundation. So if your foundation is self-esteem and I love myself, and that has motivated me to do things like care about my family and participate in the community and stuff like that. And then you have these like moments where stemming from that, you in the moment are ignoring your body and focusing purely on the moment or purely on the person. I think that's compatible with what I'm presenting. The question is the foundation.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I fully agree. I had this period this past summer where I kind of went through a similar thing where it was like the way that I had not been taught, but the way that I had interpreted what I was supposed to be in terms of my religion was I was supposed to have trust in God and not trust myself. And that absolutely screwed with me. It was just so bad. And then I got to a point where I was like, this is not okay. Like, I realized that, and bringing it back to a point that we talked about a little while ago, like, God exists outside of religion. If we believe that God exists, you cannot contain God inside of a religion. And that is something that I have come to. And so if that's the case, then everything that goes on inside of a religion is guidance. It is guidance to the ultimate end. It is, these people believe that in this religion, if you follow what they say, what they have deducted from the Bible, from everything passed down in tradition, then you will go to heaven or you will get closer to God. But if God is the foundation, then he can't be put inside of something. So then even as an individual who's in a religion, who's following it, you have to do your due diligence and be reasonable.
Yeah. You know what I'll say? Not all atheists have the same convictions I have. In fact, a lot of atheists even are collectivist, or they reject the self. And unfortunately, I think that comes with a lot of problems. And so, but what I'll say is, if you're going to be religious, or my message to religious people basically is this: if you're not going to be an atheist and be an objectivist and have all these convictions I have, at the very least, you should ask yourself, is this religious belief I have limiting my power in my life? Is it limiting the sense of freedom that I have in my life? Because if the answer is yes, then if there is a God, is that really what he would want? You know, is that really what the spiritual experience needs to be? Is this like rejection of self, almost like this like slavery to the concept of religion? So like, if you're going to be religious, if you're going to be spiritual in like the mystical sense, just ask yourself that: are these beliefs giving me power and freedom, or are they taking it away? Because if they're taking away, that's a red flag. That opens up for things like cult leaders. It opens up for like abuses in churches, and that opens up for it opens up the opportunity for a lot of negative spiritual experiences if you're giving up your power and giving up your freedom.
So explain and get a little bit more clear about what you mean by power.
Yeah. Power and freedom, I think, are there is a lot of overlap there. They're not the same thing, obviously, but like, if a religious belief inspires you to think that you're weak, that you're small, that you're incapable of doing things, then that religious belief is taking away your power in some sense. And in that sense, I'm using that very close to how I was using freedom earlier about like increasing your choices and stuff. And so like increasing your physical strength increases your power. And because you've increased your power in that context, you've increased your freedom. And so you'll notice that those are very similar and they're like relating to each other, but they're not the exact same thing. Like the strength is a power, and that power has then led to a freedom. Sometimes religious beliefs can take away your freedom and your power. And sometimes you can have power without freedom. Yeah, so like power in the sense of like self-control, in the sense of like increasing your ability to do things. Sometimes religion can take that away from people.
I agree. I want to clarify a little bit, just because like it's taken me a while to come to a definition and understanding of my faith that I'm okay enough with for the moment. I obviously want to go deeper, and anywho, um, basically, I think that the way that I see it, it's that sometimes people accept weakness and smallness as something that they're doing for God, like something that God is saying, hey, I'm going to, make you weak and make you small, and you are small under me, and all of these trials and tribulations you are holding on to for my sake. But if you don't have to, and if you actually have the potential to get out of that, if you have the potential to make different decisions and do different things that are actually in line with human dignity and freedom and virtue and value, like God, I don't think wants you to treat yourself like crap. Like God is a good God, and so in my opinion and the way that I've come to see it, he wants more good in the world, and you can only do good if you are actually allowing yourself to. Like if you are saying, okay, I'm going to actually step out and do what I can and use the gifts he's given me, and I'm not going to stay small just because I think he may want me to.
Yep. Yeah. If there is a God and if he is good, it seems obvious to me that he's not one who wants you to live a life of intense guilt all the time. Some Christians experience guilt all the time, and that's just their mode of existence. That's the motivator for how they interact with people, is guilt. And sometimes guilt motivates strange political convictions, like feeling like they have to give away all their stuff to other people or something. If there's a God and if he is good, then I don't think he wants that from you. I think he wants you to at least care about yourself a little bit more. It doesn't have to be the only thing. You don't have to be an egoist per se, but I bet God wants you to be happy. I bet God wants you to recognize the freedom that is innate in you and wants you to go out and pursue that and stop letting all these earthly rulers, getting in your way or something.
So whenever you're saying do what makes you happy, and this is where what you're saying would be totally taken out of context. What you mean, because you believe so deeply in the objectivism and the egoism, is do what makes you happy, but is also within reason. Like even within an anarchistic society, there would be some sort of not governance, but like there would be some sort of barriers. Like you can't do this, otherwise there's some consequence.
Yeah. And in fact, I actually think governance is actually a fine term, because what the anarchist rejection is not governance, but government, which is a monopoly on governance. And of course, sometimes when I can say that, sometimes I say that quickly to someone, they get very confused because I think I'm saying the same word twice. But there is a difference. There's a difference. Government is a specific type of governance, and governance is not inherently bad. It just is problematic when it becomes a monopoly. And so on the more personal level, yes, I'm not just saying do what makes you feel good. I'm saying do what's rationally in your self-interest as a human being, that's going to make you feel alive and fulfilled, not just in this empty sort of pleasure-seeking in the moment sort of way, but in a broader long-term, like invest in yourself, Don't just go... if you're thinking about your life as like a budget, like there's a difference between investing in yourself and growing that and getting dividends and building it versus spending all of your money at once on one pleasure-seeking thing. And so yes, I'm saying pursue your rational self-interest, not just your momentary pleasure, which also applies to questions of government, where I'm not saying you should be radically free in the sense that you should be allowed to go murder people whenever you want with no consequences. I'm saying that the system that is providing those consequences shouldn't be a monopoly. It should be more decentralized.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And then you also said the way that you're explaining happiness seems more like fulfillment. Do you think that there are objective measurements for fulfillment, or like how how would you argue against somebody that said fulfillment was subjective, like purely subjective?
Well, I'll say just because there isn't, so I'm not going to say there's like a quantitative measurement, but sometimes there's qualitative things. And so like quantitative, right, is like numbers, like I have 5 apples and now I have 6. And so now I have this quantitative measurement of how many apples I have. But sometimes we have qualitative measurements where it's like, oh, this pizza is good. This pizza is better. I'm not saying it's good at like 10 quantities of goodness or something, right? And this pizza is at 12 quantities of goodness. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying qualitatively, this one is an improvement. And so in a similar sense, I think like happiness and fulfillment has these sort of qualitative things that you can improve them. And the obvious answer is that, like, duh, that's what your experience is. You know, if someone can sincerely present to me an experience in which they've lived a life and they have not experienced sometimes being happier than they were before, I would be quite shocked. Yeah, and so it's probably not a quantitative thing, and so I'm presenting like seek out the qualitative improvement of things like happiness, have it long term instead of short term. And you know that, and just seek out your rational self-interest.
Okay, let's talk about natural law, because in an anarchistic society, natural law would be what would bind everybody.
Yes and no, actually, because it's okay. In some conceptions of anarchism, an advantage of anarchism is that not only has it removed the monopoly of law from the state, it also sometimes removes the monopoly of law in the sense of like natural law and common law and things like that. For example, like maybe it's I believe that there is an objective moral law. I believe that there is, I don't think this is the best way to think about it, but like there's like a set of things that are good and bad, right? In theory, you could even write it out as a list. And I believe that truly, sincerely. But part of what I like about anarchism is it presents us with opportunities to experiment. And this is actually why Rand was not anarchist, is she thought, among a few other things, she thought that because there is a set of correct moral beliefs, we need to have a monopolistic government to make sure that the correct set of moral beliefs is enforced. And I can empathize with that a little bit. And if I could flip a switch and get the exact perfect government who's going to perfectly enforce every single moral law that I believe in, then maybe I wouldn't be an anarchist. But we don't live in a world where you flip switches and get the government that you want. And so part of what's compelling about anarchism is that it provides opportunities to experiment and to decentralize our understanding of morality and law. And so maybe I'm wrong. I think I'm right. But maybe society would benefit if like this one point of tension was different, or maybe the individual would benefit if this one point of tension was different. And so we can live in community. We can have, in the context of anarchism, we can have this like commune who's experimenting with a communist form of anarchism, where everyone's has collective ownership over property and stuff. And then just across the mountain, we have this market anarchism that I prefer, where individuals have things like private property and stuff like that and engage with money. And I think that's an advantage of the system, that we get to experiment. Because when we experiment, we learn things. We learn ways that can improve our society and perhaps get us closer to that true natural law, just by having that opportunity to experiment and compete.
And that true natural law is?
Yeah, so I think like the true natural law is the like egoism as a foundation that leads to virtue, and the set of virtue and like virtue ethics. And so if the question is list out the virtues right now, I don't care to do that. But when I'm saying natural law, maybe this is more important. When I'm saying natural law, I'm saying the true set of moral beliefs that come from nature. That's what I'm saying. And so, we could sit down and try to write out those specific beliefs and those specific things, and the specific virtues. But that's really what I'm identifying.
I like natural law. I think it's a good foundation, at least, for a lot of other things. Do you think that, okay, how do you think a society, and this is just like a throw out question, just I'm curious, how do you think a society that is purely like built up from natural law would structure these different major things like healthcare, like education? Like, how would they structure these things?
I mean, I think the answer is like doing it through markets instead of through like centralized authority. Doing it through decentralized examples. So specifically healthcare, right? If you look at the history of where the current healthcare system came from, what you'll find is that before that, we actually had a very decentralized healthcare. There was either through, say, your union or your church or through your community, you'd have these small little groups that would get together and pool their money as like for what was called like happy societies and fraternal societies, things like that. So those would be the keywords to Google, would be like healthcare through fraternal societies or something like that. And these worked really well. For what was a day's wage, an individual at this time could have year-round health coverage, covering everything, everything that was accessible at the time with the technology that they had. And they also had lodge practice. So there was doctors who would set up a contract with these groups of people, with these fraternal societies or whatever, with the union or whatever, and he would be the doctor for that group. And as a result, was actually making some pretty good money. And so what happened historically was that the doctors who worked in hospitals, who preferred centralization, who preferred authority, didn't want to have to compete with these guys. And so they lobbied governments. And the countries that this happened the most in was the US and the UK. They lobbied governments for alternatives. So in the UK, the hospital doctors lobbied the government and said, hey, how about we just have universal government-run healthcare so that we, the hospital doctors, can do business with you, the government, instead of having to do business with all these poor people, instead of having to compete with all these lodge practice doctors. In the US, it got a lot more complicated. We started setting up all these rules that kind of forced people into hospitals, into these centralized bureaucratic systems for their healthcare, instead of it being decentralized, instead of it being a matter of consumer preferences on a competitive market. And so that sort of principle of decentralization in competitive markets is how I think all things should be provided in society, including the needs, including things like healthcare, food and water, education, these sorts of things that are kind of human needs. Even those should be provided through competition, through decentralization.
Let's talk about, so I have two things that I want to talk about. One is just like my own interest, and my passion is humanity. Like, I am so intrigued by where humanity is, where it's going, and how to stop it from not going in a bad direction, because like society becomes the aggregate of human choices. And how do we understand the past enough to make the right choices to make this society better? Then we have to understand like what is fundamental in humans, and the interesting point that you had brought up about how whenever you're in line with certain things, there are good consequences versus bad consequences. And Tesla had a lot of ideas about the good consequences and human society being absolutely amazing. Where do you see the world going? What do you think are the limits on humanity? And like, how do we actually create a good world?
Sure. I live in Colorado Springs, which is where Tesla and his
Interesting.
Yeah. And so I had a unique experience of growing up, and everyone knew who he was. Mm-hmm. Whenever everyone else tells me that they didn't learn who he was until like late high school or maybe even college, and they thought, oh, this is so cool, why was this guy suppressed? But I knew from like elementary school. because he's just part of the cultural staple of the city. And so I've always thought Tesla was cool, and just an interesting guy, though I don't know too much about his like personal beliefs or anything like that. But the question here is just like, how do you save the world, right? How do you keep it from going towards more unhappiness and more lack of fulfillment and more centralized power? And it's hard to say, and sometimes just a matter of context, right? So like my answer for how to fix money is different than my answer of like how to fix personal relationships, right? Though there are some common shared principles. For example, learning to accept that your interest is valid. I think that's true both of making money better and also making your relationships better. And things like recognizing that freedom is innate and just part of and something like to be acting upon, those sorts of things. But you know, we can get a lot more specific, right? Those are just broad principles that I've like defended throughout this conversation, but we can get a lot more specific on specific contexts. I do think stuff like this is really important, that you having conversations with people that have interesting ideas allows for the listener to think deeper about their own ideas. And they might not come out of listening to this podcast thinking, I'm going to go read Ayn Rand and I'm going to become an objectivist and I'm going to become an egoist. They might not do that, but hopefully they'll come out of this conversation a little bit smarter, a little bit more conscious about how they're living and what they believe, and maybe a little bit more aware of their freedom and a desire to assert that. And so it's hard to say what the broad solution is to the broad problems, but I think you're on the right path with starting with things like having good conversations and sharing that with the world.
I would say thank you for this, because actually in the mastermind that was what inspired me to do the podcast this format. The way that I was going to go about it was, so I have this thought that one of the fundamental things that needs to change is for more of the world to actually understand philosophy. I think it is my favorite piece that I've ever written, just because I wrote it purely for myself. And let me see, I'll pull it up and I'll send it to you for later.
Yes, please, please.
But it's interesting because the way that people who love philosophy approach the world is entirely differently than the way that people that don't love philosophy approach the world. People that love philosophy, and I found this with myself, I am always open to being wrong, and I'm always open to the fact that the truth that I believe may be a tiny speck in a huge truth, and I'm always looking for that huge truth. Like I'm always aware of the fact that we don't understand that much.
Yeah, absolutely. As many people have said, including Ayn Rand, ideas have consequences. The fact of the matter is that we live in a world where just as foundational as chemistry is, philosophy is just as foundational. Completely. And sometimes philosophy does things that other things can't. For example, it is not the chemists writing our constitutions, it's philosophers. And the fact of the matter is that if we don't ask ourselves questions like, what should philosophers believe and what is good philosophy, then you end up with bad constitutions. Just as like, if we don't ask ourselves what are the fundamental principles of chemistry, then we can't make these cool things that we make. I think you're absolutely right. I think philosophy is necessary for creating a better world. And not just philosophy, I will say rational philosophy that tries to get towards truth, because sometimes people approach philosophy in a way that is destructive and almost like an anti-philosophy. But yeah, I think you're onto something here. Philosophy is such an important part of that, and obviously you're taking the steps to try to promote that. And in my career, that's been a big part of what I do too. I've loved working with philosophers to help them promote their work, or I've loved helping write content for organizations to promote philosophical ideas. Anything I can do to just get people thinking more about ideas brings me a lot of joy and just makes me a happier, healthier person and helps make them a happier, healthier person. That's why right now I work for the Objective Standard Institute, and that's it. Like my job right now is to help make content around philosophy, because we want to promote good ideas and we want to give people access to philosophy and show them how that is such an important part of living a happy, healthy life.
No, I like that. I saw that OSI is having a convention in Colorado, and I was like, oh, that looks like it'd be fun.
Yeah, I would really encourage it. And anyone who's listening to this and has gone this far on the podcast, TOSCon is the conference. It's the Objective Standard, the Objective Standard Conference. We host every year. OSI is kind of a younger organization, so there's only been a few, but it will include a lot of just like really interesting philosophically minded people, including Craig Biddle, who I work for, who I really admire a lot. But yeah, you can find that.
Yonmi Park is going to be featuring.
Yes. Yep.
That's awesome.
Yep. Yeah, I'll I'll pull it up because
I'll put it in the show notes.
Sure. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. So objectivestandard.org is our organization, and then of course you can just go over to the panel that says TOSCon. You can see I went last year and really enjoyed it. A lot of Praxis people have gone at other in other years and really loved it. In the past, we've had Praxis people speak. I don't think that's going to happen this year. We haven't decided at 100% all the speakers, but we're getting close. And it's a conference for people who want to come talk about big ideas, but not just big ideas in the like useless abstract sense, but big ideas in the usefulness, in the here are big ideas that will affect your life now. Here are big ideas that will inspire you to be a better worker or a better artist or a better lover or something. That's really the focus, is we want it to be life enriching and not just philosophy for the sake of philosophy, but philosophy for the sake of life, for the sake of living and just being a happy, healthy person. Mm-hmm. And as you can see, right, that relates a lot to these ideas I have around like egoism and self-interest as a foundation. Mm-hmm. And OSI usually is out here promoting a lot of those similar ideas.
No, I love that. I'm very interested in going, which would be actually really fun. That's okay. So back to the point. Whenever I was first trying to decide how I was going to do this podcast, I had kind of thought about what I was driving, and I was like in a mental trance, and I was like, okay, what would I never regret having done? And I was like, okay, I would never regret having made a podcast and having learned some topic in much more depth. And so at that point, I was thinking along the lines of just doing a podcast on philosophy. So like OSI has the podcast on why philosophy matters, or all things philosophy. I think it's philosophy for human flourishing or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's a really good podcast. And there's also another podcast about philosophy. And I was thinking about doing something like that. But then in the mastermind, which if anybody has ever not done a mastermind, I doubt most people have ever done a mastermind. Masterminds are the best thing ever. It's basically you get in a group with a couple of people and you just talk about ideas, and you try and brainstorm how people can level up their ideas, or if they're stuck in some sort of career situation or creative work or whatever. You all talk about it, bring a lot of brains together, and you brainstorm a really cool idea. And so in our mastermind, you had said, why don't you just talk to people about it? Like, you don't seem like you know where you want to go with this. And I was like, that is the smartest point, because I don't know what the issues are. Like you were just explaining about humanity. Like, it's a huge topic. To know and to say that I know what the issue is and I know how to fix it is kind of, I don't know, it's arrogant, especially for me as a young person. So then for me to talk to people, like, that's what I need to be doing. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm really happy I could have that impact. A skill that I've noticed I've had over the years that people give me a lot of compliments on is not just promoting ideas, but helping people discover what they believe.
Well, then on that note, let's go back to freedom. Why should they care about freedom?
Well, I think that they should care about that personal freedom more than they care about political philosophy. I care about political philosophy because I enjoy it. And obviously political philosophy does matter and affects your life. You know, what laws are around you, how the society is structured does matter. But I actually think that on average, a lot of 16-year-olds end up caring about political philosophy too much. There's kind of a stereotype of a 16-year-old, I don't know, going on 4chan or Reddit or something, and then defining their whole life around a single political identity. They're like, I'm a communist, therefore I believe XYZ, and I'm only going to hang out with communists, and I'm going to spend every day on the internet getting mad about capitalism. And that can be really unfortunate. And even people who they get into ideas that I like, libertarianism and anarchism, sometimes it becomes such a core element of their identity that they end up losing their freedom and power because they just get kind of lost in the sauce of that. And so if you're 16, I think focus more on that concrete freedom instead of the abstract freedom. Focus more on the things like going to the gym so you can build good habits in your life so you can make more decisions and you can build the life that you want. Focus on learning how to invest and budget at a young age so that you can, as you get older, have all this money to do whatever the fuck you want. You know, and so I think that as is my advice for anyone, philosophy should be this practical endeavor. And if something like political philosophy is not immediately practical or useful to you, then don't engage it. And in fact, the world would actually probably benefit if a few people who have strong opinions about political philosophy just stopped. You know, there are many people in the world who should not have who should post less on Facebook about politics. They would probably be happier and make society better off and stop annoying their friends if they post about politics less. And so political philosophy matters. It's very important. And I enjoy it just on a personal level. It's what I enjoy reading. But it doesn't have to be what you enjoy. And you should be honest with yourself about that. And you should also be honest that if you don't enjoy it and you don't want to do the work of reading the philosophical texts and thinking really hard about it, you should maybe soften your opinion a little bit and not be such an aggressive person on the internet.
No, I like that. Okay, so then the main point would be freedom is not just a political thing. Like the fact that we associate freedom singularly with politics is not correct. It's not accurate. Freedom is life. Like that's it. You should be free to live your life and make choices. And you gave the example of having the freedom to work and making that decision and then saving up and knowing that you can count on your savings. Yep. And
I think you're summarizing this correctly. Exactly. I that's why I think that like distinction I'm trying to make about abstract freedom and concrete freedom, which maybe philosophers have said in other ways, but that's language I tend to gravitate towards. On just knowing that distinction exists can illuminate a lot of things and can maybe inspire you to care a little bit less about the abstract political freedom and a little bit more about how do I be free right now?
Okay, so abstract versus concrete is conceptual versus applicable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I like that. I've been thinking a lot about the difference between conceptual versus applicable in terms of what I learn in general. Like, I think I got really used to in school learning conceptually and only conceptually and telling myself that this would be important one day. And the interesting thing is that whenever something's applicable, you care about it more. I mean, you remember it more. And yeah, it's a big thing to understand that freedom is not just this conceptual thing. Yep. It's also deeply applicable.
There is a good story about Ayn Rand interacting with, I think, Leonor Peikoff, who ends up becoming her like heir, basically. Where as a young boy, he comes and talks to her and says, Rand, is morality a matter of philosophy, or is it a matter of practicality? Sort of, because sometimes we have this distinction in our heads that like philosophy isn't a practical endeavor. And Rand said, well, obviously both. Like, what are you talking about? This is kind of a silly question. But in that moment was really impactful for Peikoff and even for someone listening to try to understand like Rand and good philosophy. Good philosophy should be useful. It should be something you can apply to your life. It shouldn't be I actually think Peikoff, as he got older, said something along the lines of, if philosophy feels like you're in the weeds, right? We talk about being in the weeds of like philosophy. If it feels like you're in the weeds, then stand up, like go look somewhere else, because that's not what good philosophy should be. Good philosophy should be a practical endeavor that's useful to your life.
No, I like that a lot. I like that because sometimes a study like philosophy seems like in and of itself, the learning is necessary, and it's a good thing. Like you have acumen if you are learning philosophy. But it's interesting because like you're saying, it's not just about learning philosophy. It's about learning philosophy that you can actually apply, which is super practical. And then it goes deeper. It's like, live your life, like do what you need to do to live a good life and to participate well.
Yeah. And this has been a very good and long conversation. If anyone wants to hear me say similar things in more like a 20-minute format, I did an interview with Mitchell Earl for the Praxis podcast. You could probably just Google like Gabriel Mitchell Praxis or something. And
it's called Self-Directed.
There you go, Self-Directed.
Yeah.
And so part of what we talk about is like how philosophy is a tool that you can use specifically to benefit your career in the context of the podcast. And yeah, I think philosophy should be this practical, useful thing. It shouldn't just be a waste of time. And if it is a waste of time, do something else. Go play soccer. Go love your girlfriend or something, do something like more life enriching.
Ooh, shoot. Okay, I actually have one other question before these rapid fires.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was reading in a book. I don't know if you know. Okay, so the dude that created the book Flow, okay. He's a Russian dude. His name is Mihaly.
Yes. I just Googled it to see. Yeah, a handsome guy.
I haven't actually seen him in a picture, but he has a really cool book called The Evolving Self, and it's basically about psychology, about freedom, pretty much. And his whole book it's a really good book, and whatever. Anyways, so one of the things that he was talking about, and likewise, one of the things that Viktor Frankl talked about was the fact that freedom actually hinders people. Like the fact that you have responsibility, and the fact that you have to make choices, and the fact that nobody tells you what to do, it hinders people. So how do we approach that? Like, how do you, as somebody who says that people need to be free, approach the fact that sometimes freedom is not like desirable?
So there are like psychological phenomenons of things like decision paralysis, right? Where you have so many decisions that you struggle to make one. And we also know that there's certain studies where there's things like if your decisions are limited, sometimes you'll like the decision you made more. I think there's one study where like you're allowed to pick between a bunch of different artworks, and some people only could pick between 2, and some people got to pick between 10, something like that. And that, if that's a fact of our psychology, that's a fact of our psychology, and I'm not going to say that it isn't. What I will say is that it is I think there can be a lot of benefits to artificial limits. For example, when I play a game, I like that there are rules to the game and that I can't just do whatever I want. But what's important about that is I consented. I agreed to do that because it is in my self-interest. And so in the areas where you do suspend your freedom, and make sure it's a matter of consent, that it's not some bully or some tyrant restricting it. 2, make sure that restriction of your freedom is in line with your self-interest. And so that's why my worldview, it's important to know that my worldview isn't just freedom, right? It's self-interest as a foundation, and then freedom is the conclusion. And so it's conceivable to me that there are certainly times in life and moments, contextual moments, where restricting your freedom a little bit is going to be beneficial. An example, a board game. But it's important that comes from a place of consent and comes from a place of it being actually in line with your self-interest.
Okay, got it. That's a good answer. Okay, rapid fire. You ready?
Yes.
Okay, so don't take too long answering these questions. They are just whatever pops into your head first thing.
Yep.
All right, ready?
Yes.
Why does life matter?
Because in order for anything to matter, life has to matter.
I like that.
Yeah.
How do you show up in your own life?
I, out loud, will literally say, I am choosing to be conscious to do this thing.
I like that too.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is one way that you've learned to experience the world that adds to your existence?
I personally find a lot of joy in experimenting with chemicals, such as recreational drugs, and I have learned that that can be very enriching when done correctly and done safely and done with a lot of rationality.
Okay, and last question, a book recommendation.
I would recommend reading Ayn Rand's Virtue of Selfishness. I would also recommend reading Nathaniel Branden's 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. They actually were lovers, as some might know, and The Virtue of Selfishness is a very good like rationalistic philosophy book. 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem is a very good psychology book. They both touch on a lot of similar things, and depending on the type of person you are, one of those may be better.
All right, well, I love that. Thank you very much, Gabe, for coming on the podcast. Yeah. I have deeply enjoyed our conversation, and potentially we can have another one. Yeah, dude, I really enjoy you, Ella. I think you're a dope person, and hope this is the birth of a wonderful friendship. And perhaps I'll see you at TOSCon, perhaps I'll see you at Praxis Weekend, and perhaps we'll have opportunities to chat more.
I hope that you found this episode enriching. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you would like to write a rating or a review, that would be fantastic. You can also follow me at Innate Freedom Podcast. I'm looking forward to our next episode. Cheers.